Welcome back to Biblical Theology today. Today we're not actually doing biblical theology. We're going to do a little bit more of philosophical theology. And the reason why is that the topic that we're touching on today really influences how we read, especially some stories in the Old Testament, quite a bit. We're going to be talking about something called classical theism, which is on this side of the board. And opposite of that, we're going to talk about not classical theism. The theologies that really challenge classical theism, which fall under the heading of the Anti-Hellenization Thesis. We're going to talk about what these terms mean a little bit more, a little bit later on and give you some more detail. To start off, though, we'll be on this side of the board with classical theism. Whenever we think about classical theism, we're thinking about Greek philosophy and specifically the thoughts of a fellow named Plato, who lived a couple of centuries before Jesus came on the earth. And the thinking of the Greek philosophers and specifically of Plato have a huge influence on especially early Christian thought, but really modern Christian thought as well. A lot of the early Christians felt a lot of animosity from Greek and Roman philosophers, and especially Greek and Roman philosophers who followed in the thinking of Plato, the Platonist. The Platonists really didn't understand Christianity for a long time, but they really liked to make fun of it. They would look at Christianity and say, this just seems like a very silly system. You say that you believe in one God, but it really looks like you believe in three gods. You believe in a resurrection of the dead. What's God going to do? Make all of the different particles that made up your body somehow come back together and make your body again? And so the people who, after Jesus has come and the church has been established, the people who really liked the thinking of Plato challenged Christianity a lot. And this led a lot of the early Christians to influence with Plato's writings and his thinkings all the time. And they did that for a couple of reasons. Number one, they wanted to be able to defend Christianity against Plato's philosophy. But secondly, as they started reading Plato, they started saying, wait a minute, there's actually a lot of ways where Plato seems to be arguing a lot of the same things that we're arguing. There's a lot of places where it actually seems like our Christian theology and Plato's philosophy can be compatible. And one of the places that really made Plato appealing right off the bat was the fact that Plato was a monotheist. He believed in one God. And the early Christians were living in a world where most people were not monotheistic. We know about the Greek and Roman pantheons and how there were all of these different gods, and one god of the sea and one god of the sky and one god of so on and so forth. And so the fact that Plato was a monotheist was really almost refreshing to a lot of the early Christian thinkers. On top of that, the God that Plato believed in was a God who was perfect. He had the attribute of perfection. And the early Christians really appreciated this as well, because again, they're living in a world where most people believe in a plurality of gods, and the gods that they believe in are far from perfect. In fact, gods like Zeus and Aphrodite and Poseidon don't care about being perfect. They're more powerful than everyone else, so they can do what they want. They don't care about being virtuous. They don't care about striving for any sort of excellence. They're big, they have the thunderbolts, so they do what they want and you get in line. And so the fact that Plato is teaching about a God who is perfect in every single way, again, is very refreshing for early Christians. And it starts making early Christians think maybe there's a little bit more that we have in common with Plato than we thought at first. And as they start listening to Plato's arguments for the existence of God and his arguments based on perfection, they start appropriating certain portions of Platonic thought and kind of merging it with Christian theology. Now, they did this carefully. There were a lot of things Plato taught that they didn't adopt because they saw them as unbiblical, but there were a lot of ideas that Plato had that they thought were in line with the scriptures, and so they were fine adopting certain terms and certain arguments and certain ideas. And that's really what we want to start off thinking about and talking about. We want to fill in number 3, number 4, and number 5, and look at certain doctrines that Plato taught that the early Christians adopted and how that's kind of influenced how we read the scriptures and how we think about God. Plato has an argument about perfection that is very interesting. Plato argues that for a being who is perfect and will remain perfect to exist, certain things have to be true. The first thing that he says has to be true, and really just the big thing that we're talking about here, is that a perfect being who is perfect and will remain perfect cannot change. That's a really big statement, but Plato explains it this way. He says, if you have a being who is perfect, and then that being changes, he either changes for the better or for the worse. So if you have a perfect being and that perfect being changes for the worse, he's no longer perfect. If you have a perfect being who changes for the better, he's now more perfect, which means that he wasn't perfect before. So perfection has to be constant. There can't be any increase or any decrease. For perfection to be perfection, it has to be constant, it has to be the same. There cannot be any change. Which leads Plato to an idea that he calls God's immutability. If something is mutable, it can change. If it's immutable, that prefix means not. It's not changing. It will not change. And so Plato and the early Christians who follow him say that God is immutable. He doesn't change. He's not like Zeus. Zeus can be having a great day, and then Zeus can all of a sudden change his mind about everything. He can make a promise to people and say, I'm going to protect you, I'm going to, take care of you, I'm going to provide for you. And then Zeus can change. He can be unfaithful. He can forget about it. The God of the Bible is faithful, and he's unchanging. He's immutable. And you remember that whenever Moses goes to the burning bush, he wants to know what God's name is. And God tells him, my name is Yahweh, the I am. And he says to Moses, I am who I am. But in Hebrew, it's actually all three tenses. We can translate it, I am who I am, I was who I was, I will be who I will be. Moses, I don't change. The book of Hebrews in chapter 13 celebrates the same thing about Jesus. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There's a faithfulness, there's an unchangeableness about God. James chapter 1 celebrates that. There's no shadow of turning in God. Malachi chapter 3 verse 6 says it. I am the Lord, I do not change, therefore you sons of Jacob are not consumed. Right? And so this is an important doctrine for Plato. It's also it's a doctrine that's very close to the heart of the early Christians. Building on this doctrine, Plato and the early Christians have a doctrine that's very misunderstood today called impassibility. We have to kind of understand what is being spoken about here before we kind of get offended at this idea. The idea of immutability is that God cannot change. And following from the idea that God cannot change is the idea that I can't change God. So a really good analogy to use that I've used with my students this week is all of my students are changeable, and I'm changeable. My students can walk in my classroom tomorrow, and I can go absolutely ballistic on them, and they can go from having a very, very good day. They're happy, they're joking, they're laughing, their other classes have gone great, and they can walk in and I can flip my podium over and start yelling and screaming, talking about how awful they did on a test, throwing things and calling people out, and all of a sudden, how are the students feeling now? They're not feeling happy and cheerful like they did whenever they walked in. Now they're feeling embarrassed, probably a little bit scared, really angry, maybe they're sad. All of these feelings all of a sudden have changed for them. And I was the active subject, they were the passive subject. They didn't do anything to change their own mood. I acted on them and I caused them to change. The idea of impassibility is that God is not the passive one. He doesn't change, so I can't change him. I can't make God start having a bad day. I can't make him upset and offended and embarrassed the way that I can maybe make my students feel that way if I was a mean teacher. Since God cannot change, I can't make him change. He's not the passive one. I can't act on him and cause him to have a bad day or get upset or lose his temper or make his blood pressure rise. I also, impassibility, one of the really key ideas with this is that I cannot make God suffer. In Greek mythology, you could act on the gods. You could make Zeus angry and then he thunderbolts you. You could also make the gods suffer. Some of you are familiar with the stories in the Iliad and the Aeneid about Paris, who is this frat boy in Troy and decides to have a beauty contest and invite all the goddesses there. And he picks his winner and the other goddesses get very angry. They get offended. They're suffering because Paris didn't choose them and it hurt their feelings. And then they act out of that. God isn't like that. All right? I can't act on him. I can't cause him to suffer. On top of that, impassibility starts to suggest to us something about God's emotional life. By definition, emotions change all the time. One second I'm very happy, the next minute I'm very sad, then I realize I'm just sleepy, then I realize I'm not actually sleepy, I just need some ice cream, and then I get a sugar high, so I'm really goofy. All right? My emotions go like this all the time. So whenever we think about God's emotional life, or we think about God feeling something, I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's wrong to use emotional language about God, and I'm not going to go so far as to say that there's nothing like that at all in God's lived existence. But what I think we can say with safety is that God's emotions and our emotions are at least worlds apart. Worlds and worlds and worlds apart. God isn't up and down like we are. The doctrine of impassibility really is connected to the idea that God is pure bliss. This is a term, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that Thomas Aquinas uses it a lot. I think that's where I've run into it in the past. And if it's not him, it might be Bonaventure, his friend. And it's the idea that God is pure bliss, or we could say pure blessedness. It's the idea that from eternity's past, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit have lived in blessedness together. They've lived in love together. And there's no joy or happiness or blessedness lacking in God. He is pure bliss. All right? So I screw up massively. I do something terrible. I shake my fist at heaven. Am I causing God to suffer? Am I causing him to lose his happiness? Am I causing him to have a bad day all of a sudden? No. I'm not. All right. And so the idea of impassibility defends this idea of God being pure blessedness, and he's never lacking in that blessedness. The next one that we get to is building on this, is a doctrine that's called God's aseity. That's the big fancy theology word that you can learn. The easier way to say this is that God is self-sufficient. All right. If God needed something and then that need was met, that would constitute a change. God doesn't change. God is never in need. He never goes back and forth between needy and not needy. He's also all-powerful. He's also omnipotent. He's all-knowing. He doesn't lack anything. He's self-sufficient. Everything that he could ever want or need, he has. All right. And of course, that also goes with this idea of pure bliss as well. I didn't put the other circles up here, but I will now. So we have immutability and passibility. We have aseity. The next one that we have is called God's atemporality. This is the idea that God exists outside of time. Time is a created thing. If you are temporal, you exist inside of time. A is a prefix of negation, kind of like atheist is a person who is not a theist. God is atemporal, so he exists outside of time. He's not bound by time. All right? And so, again, if you're bound by time, you have a past and a present and a future. And as time goes on, that's constituting a change. You go from being young and inexperienced to being old and experienced. And again, God doesn't change. He's immutable. And so his relationship to time is very different than ours. God doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. He doesn't have a past, present, and future. He doesn't go from being young to being old. Instead, Plato and the early Christians teach something that's really difficult, so don't ask me to explain it, but that God experiences time at once. So God experiences time at once. He's not experiencing time as past, present, and future. Because he's outside of time, because he's in eternity, he's experiencing time as one common thing. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop here with these ideas on this side of the board. What we need to know now is that in the 1900s, there was something that began to be developed called the Anti-Hellenization Thesis. We said over here that all of these ideas in classical theism should be associated with the Greek system of thought, and specifically the Greek system of thought that is kind of summarized and articulated by Plato. Hellenization is the fancy word for like Greek stuff. The Hellenistic language is the Greek language. Hellenistic culture would be Greek culture. I really like Hellenistic food, which is Greek food. And so this is the Anti-Hellenization Thesis. This is the idea that all of this stuff that the early Christians got from Scripture, but also got with the help of Plato, was wrong. And again, this starts to be developed in the 1900s. We won't get into all the history there. But what the Anti-Hellenization Thesis likes to do is it likes to take Greek thought on the one hand, and then Hebrew thought on the other hand, which is, of course, the kind of the Old Testament Jewish thought, and likes to pit them together, or pit them against each other. And the Anti-Hellenization Thesis likes to argue that all of the things that we've looked at over here, and particularly these last four, these two are fine. These two, they're good with. They say, yes, monotheism, yes, God is perfect. But these four, they say, are incompatible with Hebrew thought as expressed in the Old Testament. And so the Anti-Hellenization Thesis wants to attack these four ideas. And they attack these four ideas in this way. They say immutability, if you read the Old Testament, God does not seem immutable. This is what the Anti-Hellenization Thesis would argue. In the Old Testament, we have a God who seems to change quite often. In Genesis chapter 6, he regrets that he made humanity. During the reign of King Saul, he regrets that he made Saul king. In both of those passages, it really seems like God has changed his mind. In the book of Jonah, he says, I'm going to destroy Nineveh in 40 days. And then he changes his mind and doesn't do that. And so the Anti-Hellenization Thesis likes to say the Old Testament actually shows us a God who changes all the time. And then that influences how they speak about impassibility. They don't like impassibility because not only does God change all the time, but God's emotions seem to fluctuate all the time. 1 minute in the prophets, he's very angry, talking about, I'm going to judge the daylights out of Israel. The next moment, he feels pity for his people. The next minute, he says, I'm going to have vengeance on their enemies. So God goes from anger against his people to pity and compassion to anger against other people. And they say that looks like an emotional change. It looks like God is changing all over the place emotionally. He goes in with Moses. He says, Moses, I'm angry. They made the golden calves. I'm going to strike down the people of Israel and start over with you. And Moses says, God, don't do that. And God's anger abates. And so they'll say in the Old Testament, it looks like we have a God who changes in his mind. He changes his will, his decisions. He changes his emotions. He's a very emotional God, and his emotions look a lot like our emotions. They fluctuate a lot like our emotions. Self-sufficiency is interesting. The Anti-Hellenization Thesis will be comfortable saying the scriptures do really present God as self-sufficient. God says, if I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you. I don't need you to feed me. I don't need you to bring me food. The book of Acts really emphasizes that in whenever Paul interacts with some of these Greek and Roman thinkers, that God doesn't need human hands to serve him. So they're comfortable saying, if God wanted to be self-sufficient, he could be. But according to the Anti-Hellenization Thesis, God doesn't actually want to be self-sufficient. There's an idea that the Anti-Hellenization Thesis advocates throw out quite a bit about how relationships in their mind always require a give and a take. So, as I was trying to explain this to my students today, I asked them to think about, I made all of these juniors in high school raise their hand if they've ever dated someone before. And one kid shoots his hand up because he wants all of us to know that he's had a girlfriend, and everyone else is like, oh, because it didn't go well, right? But I asked them, how would it feel to be in a relationship where there's no give and take? One side gives and the other side only takes, or the other way around, right? Maybe we would say that doesn't feel like a very healthy relationship. And so the Anti-Hellenization Thesis says every relationship has to have a give and take. You have to give something, you have to receive something. God has to give something, God has to receive something. And so God gives us salvation, he gives us adoption, he gives us all the spiritual blessings. What does he receive from us? Well, he doesn't really need anything. They're fine saying that. But he allows us to give him things like honor and glory and praise. And these are things that the scriptures suggest God really, really wants. And if we're not around, who can give him prayer? And so they sacrifice this idea that God is self-sufficient. They sacrifice his aseity and say that he makes himself needy and makes himself a person who has wants and then allows us to meet them. And then finally, they get rid of atemporality. They say God really does exist inside of time. The scriptures always suggest that God is inside of time, working inside of time, doing things inside of time. And some of them will say that God has always existed inside of time. Some of them say that God could be atemporal if he wanted to be, but that he willingly has entered into time in order to interact with us. You can probably tell from this that I am over here 110%, and I think this is very selective in how it reads scriptures. I think that it is very, it picks texts that seem to support it and doesn't really like to go with the whole thrust of scripture. And especially this idea and this idea I think are incredibly problematic. But honestly, I think that this idea and this idea are as well. And so let's think about this for a minute, because the Anti-Hellenization Thesis, God has allowed it to exist because, even though I think it's wrong, I think that whenever people start pushing these questions, it can cause us to look at the scriptures and come to a place where eventually we understand them better. So, what do we do with this idea throughout the Old Testament especially, that it does look like God changes his mind and it does look like God's emotions fluctuate? How do we understand that? Very briefly, and maybe this will be a topic of another video in the future, in theology we have two terms to deal with that. The first one is Anthropomorphism, and the second one is Anthropopathism. Anthropomorphism is VeggieTales. So you've seen VeggieTales, you've seen the scary talking cucumber that dances and looks very, very human and talks like a human, but is not a human. Anthropomorphism is whenever you take something human and apply it to something not human. And we do this with God all the time. According to 1 John, God is spirit. And throughout the Bible, we see that there's a pretty strong distinction between spirit and body. All right. So in theology, we say God is omnipresent. He's everywhere all at once. He's not limited by a body. God is spirit, does not have a body. But throughout the Old Testament, what do we see all over the place? We see things about the arm of the Lord, the eyes of the Lord, the face of the Lord, the hands of the Lord. All right. How do we understand that? Do we understand these literally? No, of course not. I don't think anyone does. Although I did find a Seventh-day Adventist cult one time that very literally read the statement when Jesus said he was a mother hen, and they taught that God had wings and a feather, which was bizarre. Most people who are in their right mind don't take these things literally, though, right? The arm of the Lord doesn't mean that God has a literal arm. It has to do with God having, this is always a reference to military might. If you stretch out your right arm, that's something that a military commander would do and send the army forward. The eyes of the Lord are supposed to be a reminder that God is with us. God knows what we're going through. He sees us, right? The face of the Lord has to do with God's benevolence, his love for us, his compassion. The hands of the Lord usually have to do with God serving us in some way, showing us mercy, caring for the poor and the widows. Sometimes they can have negative connotations. If you're an enemy of God and you fall into his hands, that's really bad for you, right? So anthropomorphism is whenever we take something human and apply it to God. Anthropopathism is whenever we do that specifically with emotions. If you read Hebrew, it never actually says that anyone gets angry with another person. You're reading the book of Exodus and Pharaoh gets mad at Moses, and it says, literally, his nose burned. Okay? But look at what we've just done. We've said that whenever these body images are used to God, they're anthropomorphisms. God doesn't literally have eyes or an arm, but this is trying to communicate a certain truth to us about God. All right? The Hebrew idiom for anger is that your nose is on fire. Your face is turned red. Your nostrils have flared. God doesn't have a nose. So whenever we talk about God's anger, again, we get back to what we said with impassibility a moment ago. It's right to talk about God being angry. That's a word that the Bible uses. So it's right. It's fine to do that. But his anger and our anger are very different things. His emotional, if we want to use the term emotional life, and our emotional lives are very different things. There's something that's all too human about saying this, and whenever we talk about God, I think naturally we know that God's just a little bit different than we are. Not a little bit, a lot of it, right? And so what's really helpful, and what's helped me a lot, as I've thought through the issue of classical theism, is to notice that classical theism never actually tries to tell us anything positive about God. It uses a term like immutable. What were the other ones we used? Impassible. What was the next one? Aseity. And then the final one was atemporality. And notice what's familiar and what is the same in all of these. Im means not. Im means not. A means not. A means not. All that classical theism is telling us is what God is not like. It's not telling us anything actually about God. It's not saying God is this. It's saying God is not this. So whenever we say that God is impassible, is that telling us exactly how to understand the thought life of, or the emotional life of God? It's not. By definition, this word is not doing that. It's telling us that whenever we try to think about that, here's what you shouldn't think. You shouldn't think God suffers all the time. You shouldn't think that you can make God have a bad day. You shouldn't think that God's emotions are just like yours. Whenever I think about atemporality, is that telling me exactly how to think about God's relationship with time? Of course not. It's telling me that whenever I think about God's relationship with time, it's not that he's inside of time. He's not temporal. And so these words, I think whenever they're attacked, it's because the people who are attacking them are giving them definitions that they don't actually have. These are not trying to tell you exactly how to think about your theology. They're providing guardrails for you so that you don't get outside the bounds. And theology does this all the time. If you think about the Trinity or the incarnation of Jesus and you look at what the church has historically said about those, it doesn't say, understand the Trinity exactly like this. It's going to say, well, the Trinity is not Arianism, it's not modalism, it's not Sabellianism, it's not partialism, on and on and on. But it's not going to tell you, here's everything you need to know. There's mystery. Anytime we think about God, there's mystery. God changing and relating to people, God being emotional, God, his self-sufficiency, his relationship with time. There's mystery there, and these words preserve the mystery by not telling us every single detail we want to know, just telling us what's not true. So the last thing that I want to get into is I want to show you what happens if we follow the Anti-Hellenization Thesis out. In the 1900s, there were three different types of theology that were developed after the Anti-Hellenization Thesis became popular. The first one is called Canotic Theology. There's Canonic Christology that some of you will be familiar with. This is a little bit different. Kenosis is the Greek word for emptying. Canonic theology is the idea that in order to preserve true and lasting and genuine relationships, God has emptied himself of certain attributes. He's limited himself. So he could be self-sufficient, he could be atemporal, but he's choosing not to be so that he can enter into genuine relationship with us. The atemporality one, interestingly enough, is maybe the most important one here. All three of the theologies that we're going to look at here have this idea that we want to preserve this idea that God is perfect, morally and every other way as well. And so there's this idea that if we have the eye of God right here, and he's looking into the future, all right, and Judd's standing here with me. So let's say that God is looking into the future, and he sees into Judd's future, and he says, tomorrow, Judd is going to wear yellow socks. I don't know, do you own yellow socks?
I don't even have socks on today.
Man. Well, let's say that God looks into the future and says, tomorrow, Judd is going to wear yellow socks. All right, we want to preserve the idea that God is perfect. And we want to preserve that he's morally perfect, but we want to preserve the idea that he's perfect in every other way too. So what happens if God looks into the future, he says, Judd's going to wear yellow socks tomorrow, and then Judd doesn't wear yellow socks tomorrow? In that case, God would be wrong. God would no longer be perfect. So, if God looks into the future, and God says, tomorrow Judd wears yellow socks, does Judd really have the freedom to not do that? He has to. Otherwise, God's not perfect. Otherwise, God was wrong about something. Otherwise, God's knowledge was imperfect. So what all three of these theologies are going to do is they're going to say, we have to get rid of God's atemporality. We have to put him inside of time. We have to put him inside of time. So the future isn't settled yet. On top of that, we need him to be, we need him to not just limit himself in the ways that we've already talked about, but this idea of God's omniscience. God could be all-knowing. He could know the future, but he needs to limit himself here, because if he knows what I'm going to do in the future, I don't have any freedom to go against it. Because if I go against it, God is then wrong. God can't be wrong. And if he's already saying, I know in the future you're going to wear yellow socks, you don't have freedom to disobey it. So what does that say about free will? And what does that say about your ability to be in genuine relationship with God? Again, this is all thought from the anti-Hellenization perspective. And their solution to this is what they call Canotic Theology. God empties himself. God limits himself. God doesn't know the future. God doesn't know what I'm going to do. So I have a measure of freedom. The next theology, you can kind of see where this is going. It's called Open Theism. Open Theism is, again, built on the back of Canotic Theology, but we've upped the ante just a little bit. This one says God exists inside of time, therefore the future is open to God. He can know every possibility, he can know every probability, he can know, there's a 60% chance that the yellow socks are worn tomorrow, but he doesn't know for sure. And as time goes along, God knows everything he can know in the present, but as time goes along, God learns. So, good example. How does open theism understand the story of Jonah? Jonah goes, God says, maybe I'm just going to make this up. Let's say God looks at Nineveh and says, there's a 5% chance that they repent. 95% chance they don't. So I'm going to say, in 40 days, Nineveh is going to be overthrown. Oh my goodness, they actually repented. That was unexpected. It was possible. I knew it was possible, but it was unexpected. So God then changes his mind and doesn't destroy them. As time progressed, God learned something about Nineveh and then responded to them in light of the information he had just acquired. So open theism, the future is open for God. God can learn. Which then leads to, and honestly, I think that the minute that we go to Canotic Theology, we're on the path down. We go to the one that I think is really kind of the logical outcome of all of this, and it's called process theology. It's called process theology. Process theology builds on these other two and says not only can God learn as time goes on, but God does other things too. God grows and God matures. Process theology will say in the Old Testament, God just massacred people. He got angry over small things. He killed someone for picking up sticks. The God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament, according to process theology, almost looks like a toddler at times. And as time goes, he learns the value of love and compassion and the value of mercy and grace. And a lot of times, according to process theology, he actually learned it from us. Again, he goes to Moses. Moses, I'm about to destroy them all. And Moses says, God, you shouldn't do that. And Moses says, and God says, you know what, Moses, you were right. And so according to process theology, this idea of relationship with God is, as God grows and matures, we get to be in relationship with him, and we get to grow and mature too, and the two of us can mutually benefit each other. We started off talking about how classical theism really, Plato's thought and the early Christian thought was really this contrast to the Greek gods and the Roman gods, who were all too human. The minute we get away from things like immutability, impassibility, God's self-sufficiency, and his atemporality, you know what we wind up with? We wind up with a God who is all too human. We wind up with a God who is too much like us. He's not perfect anymore. He has to grow, he has to mature. Perfection doesn't change like that. We wind up with a God who really isn't worthy of worship. And so, again, these ideas of immutability, impassibility, atemporality, and aseity, along with other things, like the doctrine of divine simplicity, are attacked today. And I think they're attacked today because we're not doing quite a good enough job of thinking through what claims are those terms actually making, and really what's the alternative. I would say that this is the alternative. And historically speaking, over the past 80 years, I'm right. And so I think it's worth us really wrestling with those concepts that we had on the board at first. And I think that it's really worth us considering anthropomorphism and anthropopathism as hermeneutical tools to interpreting some of these Old Testament stories. And of course, like always, there's a lot more that we could say and a lot more arguments we could give and a lot more that we could hash out specifically on this topic. But I would suggest that classical theism is a much better alternative to what we've ended up with here. And I think that as we do biblical theology, the doctrines of classical theism can help us kind of train ourselves to think about God and think about, these specific passages in light of the whole story and in light of our whole theology about God. So whenever we come to the story of Moses and God saying, I'm going to obliterate the Israelites, we allow our entire theology of God to influence how we read that story. Is this really just a divine cosmic toddler, like process theology says, or is God relating to us in terms that we can understand? Is he relating to us anthropomorphically and anthropopathically? Maybe he knows all along that Moses is going to pray, and that this is going to be a picture of an intercessor, a mediator, who stands between God and the people of God. And that God is giving us that picture in that moment. He knows that he's not really going to destroy the Israelites. He knows that he's going to show them mercy. He knew that before he said what he said. Maybe his mind never changed about that, but he's allowing that story to play out the way that it does, so that whenever we look at this and we see the idea of the guilty people and the righteous God and this mediator standing in between, we're starting to see a picture of reality and a picture of who Jesus is and what Jesus would do. And so I think that this philosophical theology can help us whenever we get to these hard passages in the Bible to think about, who is God? What do I know to be true about God? How do I interpret this one story in light of my entire theology of God? Oh, and by the way, how does this fit into the rest of the story God is trying to tell me that ultimately is going to be summarized and brought to its climax in the person of Jesus? So this is important stuff. Maybe we'll get back into some classical theism at some point, but for now, that's all the time that we have. Thanks for watching. Bye.